case you're wondering, third time's a charm. This is chapter 4, section 3 on photosynthesis. We're going to be looking at the chemical reactions of photosynthesis and how they happen. First, to understand photosynthesis, you should know that the first series of reactions is called the light dependent reactions. And light dependent reactions do as the word says, they depend on light. And they will go through and are sensitive to UV light, which has to come from sunlight usually, or some kind of grow light of some type. Light independent, right? So this is light dependent, but light independent can happen during the light or the dark. It happens at either time. And light independent is not affected by light. Now, light dependent reactions always happen on the thylakoid membrane. Thylakoid is this disc here. These thylakoid discs form stacks called grana, and they're surrounded by fluid called stroma. I know we talked about that in the past. Here you take in water and sunlight and you combine them, and what's released here is oxygen. Oxygen is a waste product of this reaction. So go ahead and bear that in mind as you go. Even though we need oxygen on at a pretty high rate, plants do not. They make more than they need. So, in order to understand how this does happen, you should know how a plant will actually the thylakoid itself, or the chloroplast, the plant cell, will actually take in that sunlight and use it. And we're going to look at this first as a picture, and then we will look at some of these words to see if it makes sense. So here we have water. Okay, plants need water. That's a surprise to no one. Watering a plant is important. Now, we're going to look at this and by following the three major players in water. The first player is going to be oxygen. That's the O here in H2O. The second player will be hydrogen. That's the H. And the third player will be the electrons that combine hydrogen and oxygen. It will be the electrons that bind those two. So when I'm looking at this reaction, I got to follow hydrogen, oxygen, and electrons. I'm going to follow oxygen first. So here's oxygen. You can see it kind of comes back around and almost leaves the area. That's because it's a waste product and it's not going to stick around. So oxygen, as having extra and really no use in this process, is gone. Electrons, well, if we follow the electrons, you see it goes onto the thylakoid membrane and travels along the thylakoid membrane, almost on top, skipping on top of the membrane. Now, this is going to allow the hydrogens, the H pluses, and you're like, why is it H plus? A hydrogen has a proton and an electron, but the electron is gone. Remember, the electron is now traveling along the thylakoid membrane. Here's the two electrons. They had to come from somewhere. There's no electron farm or something. Electrons have to come from other atoms. So the hydrogen gives up its electron, and then when that electron travels along the thylakoid membrane, it pushes hydrogens from outside the thylakoid to inside the thylakoid. So if I go back here a bit, you can see here's the thylakoid membrane. So it's taking the hydrogens from outside and pushing it into the thylakoid, which will create a high concentration of H pluses, of hydrogen ions, inside the thylakoid. So this is inside the thylakoid, this is outside, and it pushes them up. So where did the three parts go? Well, the oxygen bounces out, the hydrogen gets pushed into the thylakoid, and the electron travels along the thylakoid membrane. And that's photosystem 2. Now, I know we talked about photosystem 2 first, and you might be wondering, well, why do we call it photosystem 2 if we're talking about it first? Well, I don't have a good answer for that, okay? But photosystem 2 does this. That's the key here. Oh, so now the words I just gave you, where chlorophyll absorbs the energy from the sunlight, This sunlight coming in is going to energize these electrons to push these H pluses to do active transport. It Remember, it's pushing the H pluses from where there's few to where there's many. Remember, it's not down to up. That doesn't matter. There's a few H pluses on the bottom, and there's many inside the thylakoid, and it's going to keep pushing them in. Okay, and the rest of this we spoke about. So that's good for photosystem 2. For photosystem 1, sunlight comes in and re-energizes the electrons, and the electrons take what I like to call an electron Uber. So NADP plus is like an Uber for electrons. It takes the electrons to the next stage of photosynthesis, right? And it does that by transporting them. Those electrons have lots of energy. They're really important, and they're going to be used during the next stage to make sugar. So NADP plus is an empty Uber. NADPH is a full Uber. It's going to take those electrons from where they're found to the next stage of the process, which is the light independent reaction. Okay, that's part of photosystem 1. Another part of photosystem 1 is all these H pluses that have built up inside the thylakoid membrane are now ready to go. They are now ready to be used. And the way they're used is the H plus, the hydrogen ion, comes through this protein in a process called facilitated diffusion. And the protein name is ATP synthase. And sure enough, ATP synthase synthesizes ATP as it comes in. As H pluses come through, ADP becomes ATP, and it recharges that ATP. So it's kind of neat that it does that. We make lots of energy doing this. Not as much as, it's not the perfect system, but it's not a bad system at all. This H plus can then be attached to something else or pushed back over here and pumped back through later to keep that concentration gradient where there's many inside the thylakoid and few outside the thylakoid. That's photosystem 1. Okay, so chlorophyll again absorbs the sunlight and energizes the electrons to make NADPH, which is the high energy electron carrier, which is like the Uber for electrons, and it's going to take it to the next stage here. So hydrogen ions flow through the thylakoid membrane using ATP synthase that makes ATP every time it comes through. The name tells you what it does, which is nice. So the second stage is the light independent reaction. They use carbon dioxide. That's the black ball with the two red balls. Carbon dioxide. It uses it in the stroma, which is the fluid that surrounds the thylakoid and the grana, and it does that to make sugar. And the light independent reaction needs the ATP that was made. It needs the high energy electrons that was made, and it needs the actual CO2 that was brought in from the outside. Now here it is in specific, and I like to start with the three CO2s here. It just makes sense to me. So 3 carbon dioxides brings with it 3 carbons. And if I look here, I get a point where 3 carbons are here, and they can separate out. So 3 carbons in, 3 carbons out. That's important because unlike energy and electrons, carbons should equal each other on each side. Now, after you add 3 carbons, you also add 6 ATP, 6 units of energy, right? And 6 NADPHs, 6 electrons that are brought in. So between the electrons and the ATP, this 3 CO2s are able to attach and form a unit that could then separate one set of carbon out. It's an interesting system. It's a nice way to do this. what you get at the end of this process is half of a glucose. You get 3 carbon molecules that are half of a glucose. You add 3 more ATP and you are ready to receive your next CO2. And this process can continue as long as there's ATP and NADPH and then a little bit more ATP here. You could keep doing this process and keep making sugars. Plants that can maximize this process, that can maximize ATP and NADPH production, will be sweeter because they'll make more sugar as they go. Plants that cannot do that will not be able to do that. And let's see, carbon dioxide molecules enter the Calvin cycle. Energy is added so that you can rearrange bonds. High energy 3 carbon molecule leaves, that's here. 2 3 carbon molecules bond to form sugar. Remaining stay in the cycle. So it's saying if you do this cycle twice, you will get the first half of the sugar and the second half of the sugar. And that is it for chapter 4, section 3.